welcome to this week's video for those of you who are going to be teaching on Sunday morning. If you're going to be teaching on October the 26th on Sunday morning at Dayspring, teaching adults, then this video is designed to help to get you ready for that lesson. So if you'll grab your teaching transcript, you should have a copy of that now. We're going to look at it together and I'll give you some things to think about along the way and maybe some things that will help you as you get ready to teach Sunday. So let's look at it. Page 1 is your overview that tells you what this lesson's about. So let me tell you how it's going to tie in with the total Sunday experience. In the main worship service, people are going to be hearing about, we're going to be finishing up this Scarlet Thread series, and so people are going to be hearing about the life of Rahab, found there in the book of Joshua, or in the early pages of the book of Joshua, how God sent these spies into Jericho to kind of map out the land and all of that, and Rahab gave lodging to them, and they worked out this agreement where she would be spared when they came in and overtook the city. So we're going to be looking at that, and really what we see in the life of Rahab is a very unlikely Bible hero. You know, I mean, she in every way is not your the one that you would draw up on paper in many counts. Number one, she was a woman, which was not in that particular time and place the makings of a Bible hero typically. Number two, she wasn't even an Israelite, so there's a big strike against her in terms of being an Old Testament hero. Number three, she was a prostitute. So, I mean, she was way off the mark in terms of being what you would script out as a Bible hero, a non-Jewish prostitute. Yet, we read such great things about her because of her faith in God that she would eventually exhibit. And the New Testament actually describes her as one that God himself classified as righteous. In other words, God said she is in right standing with me. So Rahab is a perfect example that God calls people who quite frankly aren't quote unquote qualified. He calls unlikely people. So it only stands to reason, think about this, since God tends to call out people who really doesn't seem like they would be called out, and I say called out for his purposes, since God calls out the unlikely, it only stands to reason that the people God calls will respond back initially with some sort of good reason as to why he shouldn't be calling them. In other words, we tend to respond to God initially with excuses. That's what we're talking about here. So this lesson is going to show an illustration from the life of someone God calls, who is an unlikely hero, who initially responds back to God, not just with an excuse, but with a series of excuses. So we're going to look at that together. It's Moses. That's who we're talking about. And it's his calling from God at the burning bush there in Exodus 3 and 4. All right, so let's look at it. Here's the lesson you're going to teach. It starts on page 2 of your teaching transcript. What you have here is an opening illustration that from something happening in modern culture that shows an unlikely hero, and it has to do with a character in a movie that was just recently released. Maybe it's a movie you've seen, maybe it's a movie you haven't seen, called Guardians of the Galaxy. And what you see, there's a character in this movie. And in the movie, the character ends up being an unlikely hero, but there's an illustration here, kind of a heartwarming illustration that shows how this character was even an unlikely hero in real life. So it's kind of a neat story there. Now, here's the thing. I encourage you to use illustrations like this, even if you haven't seen the movie. In fact, I haven't even seen this movie, but I could use this illustration. It's a great illustration that will segue into the lesson. And here's an alternate way that you might even use this illustration, because it's talking about this character from Guardians of the Galaxy, this character named Drax the Destroyer. Here's how you might even lead in with this whole thing. You might ask the question, hey, who has seen Guardians of the Galaxy? And at this point, you will probably have some people raise their hand, and you might be thinking right now as you watch this, you might say, well, not in my group. Oh, you may be surprised. Just ask the question, all right? If nobody raises their hand, then just use the illustration as it's provided there. But if someone were to raise their hand and say, yeah, I've seen it, or I've seen it, here's what I would do if I were you. I would say, has anybody seen Guardians of the Galaxy? And if someone raises their hand, I would simply say this. Hey, describe to the class, describe the character Drax the Destroyer, and let them start explaining who he is, and then you can tie in this illustration about how he ends up being an unlikely hero to this little boy who saw the movie. All right, so that's just an intro. It's just a segue, and I encourage you to use it however it fits in. But it segues into your final paragraph, which is where you say, this movie teaches us that unlikely people can do amazing things, and the reality is we've seen this truth in the Bible. This movie didn't unveil that truth to us. The Bible's been showing us all along that God uses unlikely people to do some pretty extraordinary things. And today we're going to see that in the life of a guy named Moses. And then you're up and running, all right? So page 3, let's up and run together here. This is where you start teaching the text. Page 3 is just the background information on Moses and his calling at the burning bush there in Exodus chapter 3. So you get everything going there in page 3 where you're introducing everybody to Moses and his situation in the burning bush. Now from here, you're going to move on to show 4 different excuses that that Moses offers God as to why he's not the one that should be called to do this and why he shouldn't be doing this. So let's look at the 4 excuses. Here they are, starting on page 4. Here's the first one. Excuse number 1, Moses says basically, and these are all paraphrased excuses, obviously, but Moses says basically that someone else would do a better job. God, okay, so you want somebody to lead your people out of Egypt, so be it. I think that's a good idea, but somebody else would do a better job than I would. All right, so that's his first excuse. Almost, God, I like the idea, but you got the wrong person. Now, honestly, this is a pretty common excuse that I think that those of us who are followers of God use when God prompts us or moves us or calls us, whatever word you want to use there. I think this is an initial response that many of us have. I know in my own life, when I began to feel this tug toward vocational ministry, this was my first thought. My first thought was, I just think there are people who would do better. Because as I looked around and I saw different ministers and what they did and how they did it, I saw a specific kind of personality type and a specific kind of skill set that seemed to be involved in the work of ministry. And then I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, that's not me. I just wouldn't do a very good job of this. So this is really something that I had to work through and struggle with in my own life to work through ministry. And I think a lot of us have this excuse with God. And this excuse really pushes us, when we really think about this excuse and we lean on this excuse, I think it really pushes us to see if we really believe what we say we believe. The things that we say and quote in the Bible and the songs that we sing. We sing things like, Christ is enough for me. And we sing songs that are direct quotes of the Bible saying, if God is for us, then who could be against us? This excuse really pushes us to see if we really believe that, because God's reply to Moses, when Moses says, somebody could do better than I would, God's only reply to this excuse was, I'm going to be with you. That was God's answer. Moses says, somebody else would do better, and God says, oh no, that's not a good excuse. Why? Because I'm going to be with you. When we continue to lean on this excuse, it really exposes that we don't believe that me plus God is enough, because that's really the only response God gives to this. There's a great question there that you're encouraged to ask in the middle of page 4. Look at this. It says, are you currently serving or volunteering in some capacity for which you're not qualified, so to speak? And that's specifically talking about church or ministry related stuff. Are you serving somewhere and volunteering in some capacity where, quite frankly, your initial thought was somebody else would do better? And then it asks a follow-up question. Would you mind sharing what this is and how it's working out for you? And here's what I would encourage you to do. As you see that question, is there someone who's volunteering and giving in such a way or in such a time that it doesn't seem like they would be the most likely person, but they're doing a great job and you see how God is using them? If there's someone in your group that you know that ought to answer that question and will be a good example of answering that question, what maybe you can do is go ahead and contact them this week. Go ahead and contact them, and get them ready for that question and say, here's a question that I want you to answer in our group time this week. Go ahead and get them ready because a lot of people aren't going to answer that question because it might come across as braggadocious or spotlighting themselves. So a lot of people aren't going to answer that and say, oh, yeah, well, I serve so-and-so and it's working out great. God's using me. But if you go ahead and enlist them and say, I want you to share how you're serving in such and such and how that's been going, then all of a sudden you have somebody that can answer that question. In fact, you may not even have to ask the question. You might just say in your lesson, hey, I've asked so-and-so to share an experience. Have them share their experience. Then maybe you can follow up with a question and say, can anyone else give the same kind of testimony that you're doing something that, quite frankly, you don't think you're the right person for the job, so to speak, but it turns out you and God are handling it just fine, all right? So that's excuse number one. We see God's reply, which is simply, I'm going to be with you, which completely nullifies that excuse that I'm the wrong person for the job. That moves us to the second excuse we see from Moses. Comes on page 5. Check this out. Moses quite honestly and candidly says to God, I'm not sure that what you're saying is going to work. That's pretty much what Moses says. God says, you're going to take my people, you're going to go confront the Pharaoh, you're going to lead them out. And Moses basically replies by saying that plan has way too many holes in it. Way too many things can go wrong and throw this whole plan off course. And I love the fact that Moses is honest about that. Now, here's where you're going as you teach through this. Here's the reality. I don't think any of us would ever outright say that to God. God, your plan stinks. I don't think any of us would ever say that outright, but I do think that we would say things, not just to God, but even to other people, that are basically a way of masking this excuse to making it sound, to make it sound a whole lot better. So I want you to start thinking now, what are some things that we say, and they may even sound spiritual, they may even make us sound good in the process of saying it, but basically what we're saying is, what God wants me to do, I don't think it's the best idea. Now, there are all kinds of ways that we word it. I mean, think about how many times we've said this. Well, I'm just waiting to get a peace about that. It may be that we're waiting to get a peace about it. It may mean that we're stalling or hoping that the plan will go away because we just don't like it. There are times we talk about God opening and closing doors. Sometimes I think that's legitimate, that we really are asking God to open a door or to close a door because we're having a hard time discerning His will and we're asking Him to make it crystal clear. I think there are other times where we know that God wants us to walk into something that's pretty difficult, but we're saying, well, I'll wait till the door is wide open. Then I'll know that this is from God, when in fact what we're thinking way deep down is, I know what God wants me to do, I just don't like the plan. So this is really what you're getting at in all of this. And there's a great point that's made at the bottom of page 5. Look at the very last paragraph, okay? Because what happens is God responds to this and says, well, let me tell you what the details are. And He says, I want you to go and tell the leaders of Israel that this is what the details are. The funny thing is, their response to those details probably would have been the same exact response as Moses's, which was, I don't think that's a really good plan. So there's a great point that you're going to make. Look at the last paragraph on page 5. It says, the reality for us is that our efforts to follow God's path may not always yield the results that we expect or envision. Now think about that. Our efforts to follow God may not yield the exact results that we've envisioned. So here's my point, and really the point of this, rather. The point is, it's not whether or not things work out the way that we think they ought to or the way that we think they should. The question is, are they going to work out in the way that God intends for them to work out? And there are some great passages in the Bible that really might be beneficial to you here that you can throw in that are very helpful, like Isaiah 55 verse 9. Look up Isaiah 55 verse 9 and look at it through the filter of this second point that you're making. Proverbs 3, 4, and 5. That's a verse that you may already know. Look at those verses through the filter of this point that you're making, which is our excuse of saying, God, I don't think that the way that works out is a good way. That's not a valid excuse, because God's plans are probably different than ours, and they're probably going to work out in a way that we wouldn't expect or draw up. So that's the second excuse that Moses uses. We use that excuse too. It's a little more sanitized and spiritual sounding, but we use the same excuse. And just like with Moses, it's not a valid excuse. Let's look at the third excuse Moses used. Page 6 on your teaching transcript. Moses just flat out says, this is going to be too difficult. It's going to be too hard. It's going to be too uncomfortable. God, I don't want to do this. That's too hard. Now, this excuse that Moses uses here, and God's response to that excuse and showing that it's not a valid excuse, this confronts a myth of American Christianity, because there are many teachers who stand behind pulpits and teach and all of those things, who teach us that following God is really, it's a happy journey, full of smiles and all of that. I mean, look at there's a paragraph right before the first question that you're being asked, that you're going to ask. Look at that paragraph right before the question you ask. It says, here's a hard truth to accept. It's about a third of the way down your page. God never promises us smooth sailing when we follow his will. He doesn't even promise that we will enjoy ourselves along the way. Now, I really want you to look at that, because that might confront something that you believe personally. That not only does God not promise smooth sailing, he doesn't even promise that we're going to enjoy the ride along the way. I hear a lot of teaching that says otherwise, that ultimately we're going to be happy and not just gratified as we do the work of God, but even in the midst of hardship and all that stuff, that there's going to be this big smile on our face, and that it's every day is like a great day. That's not true. And here's something that I would ask you to consider in this, with specific to Moses. God tells him that I want you to go back to Egypt, to your people, lead them out, confront the Pharaoh, and get out of there. And God says, it's going to happen. I'm going to do this through you. I'm just telling you to do it. And then you're going to lead the people on toward the promised land. Now, here's a question specific to Moses. Was it a fun journey for him? I want you to think about him. Was it smooth sailing? And do you think that Moses, at the end of every day, sat down, or at the end of every month even, sat down and said, you know what? I'm having the ride of my life. This is a blast. I would contend that the answer is no. This was not a fun journey for Moses. I would encourage you, if you're still kind of grappling with this and saying, I don't know that I agree, Brett, read Exodus 15 or Exodus 16 or Exodus 17. Read all three of them. And I want you to see how the people treated Moses. And you tell me if that would be fun. Look at Numbers 12, Numbers 14, Numbers 16, or Numbers 12 through 16. Read all of it. You tell me if what Moses was having to deal with was fun. It was not. People were resisting him. They were talking about knocking him off. They were complaining about his leadership. They were telling him he was making the wrong moves. All the while, Moses is just following God. So Moses complained, it's going to be too difficult. And God doesn't respond back by saying, oh no, Moses, you're wrong. It's going to be great. You're going to love it. Basically, God says, yeah, it is going to be difficult. At least that's what the proof will end up being played out, that it is difficult. So you're confronting this myth that following God is a bed of roses, that it's always smiles, that we're skipping along the path all along the way and saying, isn't this fun? I'm so glad I did it. There are times where you question whether it's worth it. And God assures you that it is worth it, but it's not easy. Moses is an example. You have a question there in the bottom part of the page, or right past the middle of the page, where you ask the folks in your group, can you think of any other examples in the Bible of people who followed God, but it was not fun? And there are some helps there on your teaching tip in that gray block to maybe give you some ideas that might help them come up with some answers. But here's the bottom line. The greatest proof in all of this, that following God is difficult, the greatest proof and the greatest evidence is Jesus himself. Jesus suffered greatly, and the Bible describes him in Isaiah chapter 53 as a man who was acquainted with sorrow, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Following the path for Jesus was very, very difficult, very agonizing. He sweat blood in the process of doing this. It was so agonizing. And here's the whole point that you're going to bring out, which is brought up in your teaching script here. For Jesus, it was very difficult. The path that he walked was very hard. Yet our description that we give ourselves, followers of Jesus, meaning that what he did, that we ought to experience the same thing if we're following him. So the excuse of it's too difficult, it's totally not even a valid excuse, because God never promised that it would be anything different. So when we're leaning into this excuse and saying, God, I hear what you're calling me to do, but that's going to be too difficult, it exposes a hole in our theology and a hole in our understanding of what it even means to follow God. Moses offers this excuse. God says, yeah, but that doesn't change anything really. One fourth excuse found on page 7, and it's worded this way intentionally. I don't speak real good. That's not good English, I know that, but you wouldn't expect someone who speaks very well to say it correctly, would you? Of course not. So Moses is like, I don't speak real good. And here's what's interesting about this excuse. Number one, God's not happy with the excuse, you notice. But here's what God points to as a solution to this excuse. And to show that this excuse is not valid, God points to his brother Aaron. And he says, okay, so you don't speak very well. I acknowledge that. But look at your brother Aaron who's going to be with you. And what God is saying is this. Maybe you don't articulate things very well. Maybe you will have a hard time communicating things. But your brother's going to be with you, and he can do that just fine. So it's interesting. God is supplementing Moses' weakness by providing another person who doesn't share in that weakness. And here's what's pretty cool about that when you think about it. Think about this. Aaron is going to be the solution and really the answer for this excuse. Here's a question to think about. When did God create Aaron? When did God bring Aaron onto this earth? Well, it was years before this conversation that Moses and God are having. Years before this conversation. Which means that years before, God was already bringing people and solutions into place that were going to help Moses accomplish what he was supposed to happen, which is a pretty cool reminder when you think of it, that God has all along, even before we were born really, God was putting things into place and mapping it all out so that we would not be without, and so that we wouldn't be unable to be the person who would carry out the task that God has called us to carry out. So, I don't speak real good, Moses says. And God says, well, that excuse doesn't really work because I'm putting someone around you who's going to supplement that. Now, that excuse and that solution to that excuse is really going to be the focus of where the group conversation goes here when you now break your group into smaller clusters for the application moment. So let's look at that on page 8 and 10. Here is where you break your group into their smaller clusters. You put the group handout into their hands, which is page 10 on your transcript, and you'll see where they're going to work through that together. And it's primarily them looking at the reality that God is with us by putting other people with us, and that's a pretty cool thing when you think about it. Look at number 2 on that handout. It says, when Moses used the excuse that his skill set wasn't enough to get the job done, God pointed to his own presence, but also pointed to the presence of his brother Aaron. And this reminds us of a critically important reality when it comes to doing God's will. I love this statement. God helps us do his will by surrounding us with people who can help us do his will. So that's really going to be the focus of the group handout there, is how God is with us, that God's presence is with us, and it manifests itself through the presence of the other members of the body sometimes. So that's a pretty cool thing to think about. After that group time is worked out, and give them the time they need to do that, you'll know how to allot that time better than I do because you're part of your group. I'm not. But give them the time give them the time allotted to do that. Let them work through it, and then you can just conclude things. You've got a conclusion on page 9 on your teaching transcript. You'll notice this week again that your conclusion doesn't lead you up to the memory verse. Oftentimes, your conclusion will give you maybe a sentence or two to say, and then you'll finish by just saying, it's like this week's memory verse says, and then you finish that way. This one doesn't do that because this memory verse is really more, it really fits more with the sermon than the group lesson. So you may not want to include the Bible verse as a conclusion, although I think if you wanted to reword the conclusion, you certainly could make it tie in very well. But either way, you've got a nice clean conclusion for your lesson there on page 9. And after that, you're all done, all right? So it's a great lesson about how God uses us, because every single one of us are the unlikely candidates that God would call out to. God gifts us, God equips us, God calls us, and God surrounds us with other members of the body who supplement our weaknesses. But the bottom line is that God calls us, and when it's all said and done, we are without excuse to do what He's asking of us, because He is with us. And that's what Moses found out. All right? Thanks for listening in. Hopefully it's been helpful. God bless you, and we'll see you Sunday.